A flight attendant violently targeted a black child in first class, but seconds later, the boy's father revealed who he really was, and what happened next will leave you speechless. He tried to break a baby's world against a window. Sure, no one would stop him. Subscribe if you believe no uniform is above the law. The moment Victor Haldane strode past without a glance, Desmond Carter knew something was wrong. The flight attendant moved down the aisle with practiced speed, his polished shoes tapping a steady rhythm against the narrow carpet. He offered drinks to each row with a rehearsed smile and mechanical efficiency, except when he reached 17 degrees Celsius. There, he hesitated for a brief second, just enough for Desmond to notice the shift. Without slowing, Victor turned away and moved on, skipping over Desmond and his infant son entirely, as if they didn't exist. Desmond said nothing. He sat still, his large frame composed and steady. One arm cradled the swaddled baby against his chest, the other resting on the armrest, fingers tapping slowly. Jalil stirred faintly, a soft sound escaping his lips before he nestled deeper into the curve of his father's body. The hum of the engines continued overhead, blending into the quiet murmurs of passengers adjusting seatbelts, flipping through magazines, or idly scrolling through their phones. But Desmond heard something else, a silence, too precise to be accidental. He glanced up, catching the sharp profile of the attendant 2 rows ahead, moving quickly again, offering a drink to a man in a suit. Victor didn't glance back, but Desmond saw the tension in his shoulders, the clipped angle of his elbows. He knew that kind of movement, rigid, controlled, forced. It reminded him of situations he used to walk into during recon missions, calm on the outside, but something waiting beneath. Jalil stirred again, this time with a faint whimper. Desmond shifted the baby slightly, his hand moving gently over the blanket. The rhythm of his breathing remained slow and even, though his mind raced in ways he hadn't let it in years. He didn't want trouble. Not here. Not now. This flight was supposed to be peaceful, just 2 hours of air between one city and another, a father and his child going home. Still, the look in that attendant's eyes, the subtle curl of the lip, the twitch in his jaw, it wasn't new to Desmond. He had seen that look too many times in too many places, men who disliked your presence but disguised it behind protocol. He didn't know Victor Haldane, but he knew his type. "Excuse me," Desmond said quietly, his voice calm as he leaned toward the aisle. Victor didn't respond. "Sir," Desmond repeated, a little louder this time, his tone respectful but unmistakably firm. The man 2 rows ahead turned to glance. Victor stopped, mid-pour, then slowly looked over his shoulder. "Yes?" His voice was clipped, just short of polite. "May I get some water? I need to prep a bottle for my son." Victor stared at him for a beat longer than necessary, then gave a tight nod and walked off without a word. Desmond watched him go, his eyes narrowing just slightly. He wasn't angry, not yet, but every inch of his body stayed alert. From across the aisle, a teenage boy looked up from his headphones and caught Desmond's eye. He looked away quickly. When Victor returned, he didn't hand the water to Desmond. He didn't speak. He dropped the plastic bottle onto the tray table with such force that it bounced once, rolled slightly, and stopped at the edge with a soft thunk. Desmond caught it before it fell. He didn't react, not visibly. His fingers curled around the bottle, his other arm holding Jalil steady. But his eyes followed Victor's retreat down the aisle, memorizing his stride, the stiff tilt of his shoulders, the way he avoided every other black passenger with mechanical ease. A middle-aged man in the next row leaned over slightly. "Everything all right?" he whispered, eyes flicking between Desmond and the attendant's back. Desmond gave a small nod. "For now." The bottle clicked softly as he opened it and began preparing the formula with slow, deliberate movements. Years in tactical work had taught him that even in moments of peace, preparation was everything. He moved with the precision of someone who knew how quickly calm could turn into crisis. He shifted his son in his arms. Jalil's tiny fingers brushed Desmond's collar and the baby gave a soft sigh. The plane vibrated gently as it climbed. Outside the window, clouds hung thick and low, cotton layers lit by the early afternoon sun. But Desmond wasn't looking at the sky. His gaze drifted to the forward galley where Victor stood with another crew member, whispering something too low to hear. Then Victor turned, eyes scanning the cabin, and for a flicker of a second, they met Desmond's. The contempt in his eyes was no longer hidden. Desmond looked down at his son, smoothing the edge of the blanket. His face remained expressionless, but his mind was already drawing lines, assessing paths, noting witnesses. His instincts never turned off, not really. Victor walked past again 5 minutes later. He didn't stop. He didn't look. But this time, Desmond noticed the way his hand brushed the cart, how his jaw twitched, how his pace slowed near row 17 before accelerating again. Every move told a story. And Desmond was listening. There were too many unknowns for a confrontation. Not yet, but something told him this flight would not be ordinary. Something told him the man in the uniform wasn't done. Desmond adjusted Jalil one last time, then leaned back, eyes fixed on the seat in front of him, mind sharpening like a blade just out of its sheath. The hum of the engine faded beneath a deeper silence. The aisle seemed narrower now, the air heavier. He didn't know when it would happen or what would trigger it, but he could feel the storm building. Sometimes the calmest skies hide the most dangerous storms. Victor Haldane dropped the water bottle onto Desmond Carter's tray with a sharp clack. Not tossed, not handed, but slammed. The plastic trembled on impact, wobbling dangerously close to the edge before settling. The suddenness drew startled glances from nearby passengers, the kind that lingered just long enough to ask, was that really necessary? Then they quickly looked away, feigning distraction with in-flight magazines or seatbelt buckles, unwilling to be drawn into something that wasn't yet a scene, but could easily become one. Desmond didn't flinch. He reached for the bottle slowly, deliberately, as though refusing to let the aggression shake his rhythm. He unscrewed the cap with a steady hand and poured the contents into a formula container resting beside his son's small bag. Jalil, still quiet and sleepy against his chest, shifted only slightly, letting out a soft, instinctive whimper at the unfamiliar clatter. Victor lingered a second too long in the aisle, his lips pressed tight, eyes narrowing as though expecting a complaint. When none came, he turned sharply and strode back toward the galley, the muscles in his jaw twitching. Behind him, the tension remained, invisible but coiled, like a wire drawn tight across the cabin. Desmond exhaled through his nose and leaned closer to his son, gently lifting the bottle to test the temperature on his wrist. Lukewarm, just right. As he guided the nipple into Jalil's mouth, the infant latched with a soft sigh. Desmond felt a flicker of peace in that moment, but it was brief, disrupted by the awareness that the man across the aisle had just declared silent war. He had dealt with men like Victor before. They wore uniforms and smiles, cloaking their bias behind protocol and routine. Desmond had seen them overseas, supervisors who gave the worst assignments, officers who looked past him in briefing rooms, border guards who scrutinized him with just a little more suspicion. It always started like this, a small, deliberate slight, followed by escalating pressure, testing boundaries, measuring reactions, and it always ended the same way. One side pushed too far, and the other made the mistake of giving them what they wanted. He wasn't going to give Victor what he wanted, but Victor wasn't finished. 10 minutes later, as the cabin lights dimmed to signal cruising altitude, Victor returned to check on passengers. His smile was back in place, stiff and mechanical as he moved row by row, offering snacks with rehearsed politeness. But when he reached Desmond's aisle, the smile vanished. He skipped over Desmond entirely, leaning instead toward the man seated directly behind him. "Something to drink, sir?" Victor asked, voice overly sweet. The man behind Desmond blinked, confused. "Oh, didn't you just skip?" "We're moving in order," Victor snapped, the fake charm breaking. "Please don't interrupt the service flow." The passenger raised his hands in surrender. "Sure. Sorry." Desmond said nothing. His eyes followed Victor's every move, not with aggression but calculation. A chess player watching the board shift, noting every pattern. There was no mistaking the intent now. This was targeted. The nearby passengers began to sense it, too. A young man in a hoodie, seated diagonally across the aisle, frowned and kept sneaking glances at Desmond. An older gentleman with glasses, 2 rows ahead, paused mid-page in his book and tilted his head, trying to listen without turning. Desmond could feel the cabin bending around them, as if the atmosphere itself had narrowed into a corridor of tension. Every sound seemed sharper, the hum of engines, the clink of plastic trays, the scratch of zippers. Jalil had fallen asleep again, his small breaths warm against Desmond's collarbone, and Desmond adjusted the blanket around his son with the same slow, trained control he'd once used disarming traps overseas. Careful, measured, aware that even the subtlest movement could trigger something worse. From the galley, Victor watched. He leaned toward one of the junior stewards, a timid-looking man with neatly combed hair and nervous eyes. "Keep an eye on 14C, Victor murmured. The steward looked down the aisle. "The one with the baby?" Victor's voice lowered further, but the venom slipped through. "Yeah, don't let the quiet fool you. That one's going to be trouble." The steward hesitated. "He just asked for water." Victor's smile twisted. "Exactly." Meanwhile, Desmond stared at the window, its glass reflecting his face in fragments. His reflection was calm. His hands were steady. But deep inside, he was counting the number of steps it would take to get to the emergency exit, the number of seconds it would take for someone to intervene, the number of people between him and the man who had just made his child a target. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he would not lose one either. He shifted slightly, tucking the bottle away and gently cradling Jalil closer. Every movement was protective, instinctive. The seatbelt sign overhead clicked off with a soft chime, but Desmond remained seated, grounded not by instructions, but by vigilance. Victor passed through the aisle once more. He said nothing this time, but his shoulder brushed Desmond's arm, too forcefully to be accidental. The message was clear. Desmond blinked once, slow and deliberate. He knew exactly what kind of man Victor was now. Not just a petty authoritarian, not just a hostile employee, but the kind who mistook kindness for weakness. The kind who saw a quiet black man with a baby and assumed he could intimidate him without consequence. But Victor had miscalculated. Desmond was not afraid. And, more importantly, Desmond was prepared. He reached into the seat pocket and pulled out a small cloth to wipe Jalil's face, the motion smooth, composed. Yet even that simple act had a weight to it now. A father tending to his son under the eyes of a man who had already decided he didn't belong. Across the aisle, the hoodie-wearing passenger whispered to his friend, "Something's off with that flight attendant. You saw how he slammed the water, right?" His friend nodded, casting another glance toward Victor. "Yeah, dude's got issues." Desmond heard them, though he didn't turn. Every word, every shift of posture added layers to the storm forming just beneath the surface. He didn't know when it would break, but he felt it coming. Victor disappeared toward the galley again, and for a brief moment, silence settled in the cabin. Desmond took a breath, steadying himself, not out of fear, but readiness. His hand gently patted his son's back, soothing him with a rhythm that had once quieted far more dangerous situations. Because Desmond Carter knew one truth better than most. The moment before violence is always the quietest, and this flight was growing far too quiet. One request for kindness can expose the deepest cruelty. The moment the baby's cry cut through the cabin air, sharp and sudden, it was like a signal, not just for concerned passengers or distracted crew, but for something uglier, festering just beneath the surface. Victor Haldane's neck stiffened as if the sound scraped against his nerves. His steps halted. The beverage cart behind him sat idle, forgotten, as he turned and narrowed his gaze down the aisle. His jaw clenched. His nostrils flared with quiet rage. Desmond, unaware of the eyes locked onto him, gently rocked Jalil in his arms. The baby's cry, though piercing, was no different from the cries Desmond had soothed 100 times before. The gentle rhythm of a father's sway, the low, calming hum in his throat, it all unfolded with a practiced grace. But peace was not what the moment would bring. Victor moved. He didn't walk, he strode. Long, purposeful steps cut through the narrowing aisle like a blade. His face was tight, all pretenses of courtesy dropped. He stopped at Desmond's row, towering above him, his voice a controlled hiss. "Control the noise." Desmond looked up, weary but composed. His voice was low, even, without an ounce of defiance. "He's just a baby. He'll settle soon." Victor's lips twitched, but it wasn't a smile. It was something colder. A flicker of resentment passed through his eyes. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. In the next breath, a single, stunned breath, he lunged forward. Gasps burst through the cabin like a shattering window pane. Before Desmond could even process what was happening, Victor's hands were on Jalil. Not gently, not with any human understanding, but violently, ripping the child from his father's arms with a yank so rough Desmond's shoulder jolted forward. The air felt sucked from the space, replaced by a stunned silence and the growing pitch of panic. Desmond stood halfway, caught between shock and fury, but Victor was already turning, holding the child as if he were nothing more than an object of irritation. Passengers watched, mouths agape, some whispering, some frozen in horror. A man 2 rows back fumbled with his phone, hands trembling as he lifted it to record. Another stood halfway out of his seat but hesitated, paralyzed by the madness unfolding. Victor raised the child toward the window. "No!" Desmond's voice thundered, but it was too late. With a cruel force, Victor pressed Jalil's head against the cabin window. A dull crack echoed, followed by a sickening silence. A thin line fractured through the oval glass, spiderwebbing outward. Blood, bright and jarring, trickled down from the baby's temple, following the curve of his tiny ear and staining the collar of his onesie. Time fractured with the glass. Desmond's body stopped moving, but inside, everything collapsed. Noise came rushing back, the screams, the gasps, the shrill chime of call buttons being slammed repeatedly. Somewhere, a voice cried out for help. A boy in the back row began to cry. Phones were up now, all around. Passengers documented every second, too afraid to intervene, too shocked to believe it was real. Victor's face was unreadable. Not rage, not panic, just blank. Like he was above consequence, like he'd done nothing wrong. He kept one hand on Jalil's torso as if trying to justify some twisted sense of control. Desmond, still half risen, stared. His arms ached with absence. His knees trembled, yet his hands did not shake. He took a single step into the aisle. His eyes met Victor's. In them was no pleading, no panic, just fire, contained, simmering, ready. "Give him to me," Desmond said quietly. "Now." Victor didn't move. The engine's hum was deafening now, mixing with the rising murmur of passengers, the rustle of seats, the clicking of belts unfastened in defiance of safety rules. A man across the aisle shouted, "Let the baby go!" But Victor didn't even turn. Jalil's arm twitched, then fell limp again. Blood dripped in slow intervals onto the cabin carpet. Every fiber in Desmond's body screamed for action. Training surged to the surface like a tide, every controlled breath, every tactical scenario, every ounce of precision. His son was injured. His son was in danger, and no one was going to stop this, except him. Desmond's hand inched toward his waistband, but he stopped himself. Not yet. Not with the window already cracked. Not without a plan. He locked eyes with the man holding the phone camera. The man gave the slightest nod, silently affirming that the world was watching. Then Desmond's gaze returned to the child. His child. The pain on Jalil's face, the stillness in his limbs, it tore something inside him. A part that had weathered war zones and battlefield scars, a part that once believed there was a limit to cruelty in civilian life. Victor leaned closer to the window, as if trying to prove something. Desmond moved an inch forward. "You've done enough. Put him down." Victor finally turned his head, his expression smug. "You people always think rules don't apply to you." A sharp breath drew from the passengers. Desmond didn't blink. His silence was louder than any scream. The baby moaned softly, barely a sound, but it pierced Desmond's chest more deeply than the earlier cry ever had. It was life. Fragile. Flickering. And suddenly, Desmond's world shifted. The fear left his body. The rage refined itself into resolve. He stopped shaking. His silence grew colder. Passengers around them watched, breaths held as the standoff crystallized. 2 men, 1 broken window, and a child bleeding between them. Somewhere in the back of the plane, a man called for the captain. Another shouted into a phone trying to alert ground control. But up front, time moved slower. Jalil's head slumped. And in that instant, something unspoken passed between Desmond and Victor. The illusion of safety was gone. The mask of control had shattered. And so had the glass. The sound of breaking glass was only the beginning. The baby slumped, unconscious, blood matting his hair. For 1 full second, the world stopped breathing. Desmond Carter's body moved before his mind caught up. His arms, once cradling life, now hung heavy at his sides, hands curled into fists. His gaze locked on Victor Haldane, the tall, sharp-featured flight attendant whose eyes still burned with the last flicker of unrepentant fury. Around them, the cabin exploded into noise. Passengers screamed, some shouted for help, others scrambled to press call buttons with frantic fingers, their eyes wide with disbelief. But none dared intervene. Victor remained hunched over, his hands still near Jalil's small frame, as if unsure whether to cling to the moment or flee from it. The window beside him bore a faint but visible fracture where the baby's head had struck. A trickle of blood snaked down the plexiglass, catching a slant of cabin light and painting the pane in a ghastly hue. Desmond stepped forward, slow, controlled, his boots quiet against the carpeted floor. Every motion was precise, no wasted breath, no wasted energy. His muscles remembered what his heart now demanded: eliminate the threat. Victor's expression began to shift. The confidence he had worn like armor fractured at the edges. He took a half-step back, then froze as Desmond reached beneath his jacket. The cabin, though filled with cries, seemed to hush around that single motion. From the concealed holster secured under his shoulder, Desmond drew a compact sidearm. It gleamed briefly in the overhead light, a federal-issued firearm still bearing the serial tag of his service days. It was legally carried. It was deliberately drawn. Gasps filled the air. A man, 2 rows behind, ducked instinctively. A woman clutched her husband's arm, covering her own child's eyes. Phones now pointed directly at Desmond, but he didn't care. He wasn't thinking of footage or headlines or what might come after. His entire being focused on one truth: his son's blood had been spilled. Victor's mouth opened as if to protest, to claim innocence, to say something that might reassert control, but the words never came. His body trembled, and in his eyes bloomed the dawning terror of a man who had underestimated the quiet passenger in 12C. His hands, once so sure, now hovered in the air, unsure whether to shield, beg, or fight. Desmond took one more step forward and raised the gun, not to Victor's chest, but to the window, the same window that now bore Jalil's blood. The message was clear. Victor followed the angle of the barrel with his eyes and then back to Desmond's face. He knew. "Don't," Victor whispered, his voice shaky, almost childish. Desmond's voice was ice. "Let go of my son." Victor hesitated. For a breath, he looked down at the unconscious baby as if realizing for the first time what he had done. But the moment passed, and his arrogance, stubborn and foolish, returned in a twitch of his jaw. He gripped Jalil again, tight. Desmond fired. The bullet didn't hesitate. It punched clean through the weakened window, the glass shattering with a sharp, crystalline scream. It tore through Victor's chest in the same instant, the force sending him reeling backward as the plane jerked violently. The sudden decompression hit like a hammer. Oxygen masks dropped from overhead, the rush of air howling through the cabin. Loose papers and wrappers lifted like birds caught in a storm. A hat flew past Desmond's shoulder. Somewhere, a man cried out in panic. Victor's body slammed against the opposite wall, then slumped to the floor, crumpled and still. The gunshot's echo faded, swallowed by the roar of escaping pressure. Around Desmond, chaos returned. Passengers pulled on their masks with shaking hands. Some cried, some sat frozen. Others ducked beneath seats, unsure if more bullets would follow, but Desmond didn't move. The gun lowered slowly to his side. In his other arm he scooped Jalil's limp form back against his chest. He barely noticed the blood that now smeared his shirt. His eyes never left the cracked window. It had held, barely. He could hear the captain's voice over the intercom, distorted by static and noise, commanding order, instructing passengers to remain calm. Crew members, male, wide-eyed, rushed toward the breach, toward Victor's motionless form, and toward the man who had just upended the sky with a single pull of a trigger. But Desmond stood as if carved from steel, arms locked around his son, eyes burning with a promise made the moment blood touched glass. Whatever followed, charges, headlines, fury, he would face it. But first, his son would live. One shot can change the sky itself. The window exploded, not with a thunderous boom, but a sharp, stomach-turning crack that split the air like a bone snapping in two. A roar followed, an invisible beast of rushing wind that tore through the cabin with primal fury. Oxygen masks dropped like startled birds, dangling lifelines in the chaos. Passengers screamed, papers flew, drinks scattered, and trays slammed upward from the force of decompression. The sound was overwhelming, sirens blaring from hidden corners, infants crying, and overhead bins rattling under sudden strain. But in the center of it all, Desmond Carter moved with eerie calm. He didn't shout. He didn't flinch. He tightened his arms around his son. Jalil's head lolled limply against Desmond's shoulder, his tiny frame limp, blood smearing his soft curls. But there was breath. Shallow. Fragile. Real. Desmond pressed his cheek against his son's, his chest rising and falling in tandem with the slight rhythm of life he felt beneath his fingers. It was enough, for now. The emergency lights bathed the cabin in a pulsing red hue, turning every face into a mask of fear and confusion. The silence between screams was filled with the hiss of air, the mechanical whine of pressurization trying to stabilize. Flight attendants scrambled like startled animals, unsure whether to reach for the emergency door protocols or check on the passengers, their training battling against instinct. Victor Haldane's body lay twisted near the aisle. His chest no longer rose, his eyes still open, wide with a look not of pain, but disbelief, as if he had never imagined that the man he mocked would be the same one to end his cruelty. One hand was outstretched, fingers curled as if they had one final command to give. But the war in the cabin had ended for him in a single shot. The cracked window behind him was now webbed in frost, sealed tight with rapid emergency protocols kicking in. A metal shutter had locked in place over the breach to stabilize cabin pressure. Still, the shock lingered in the air like smoke. Desmond lowered himself back into his seat. Passengers gawked, some crying, others whispering in disbelief. A few clutched their children tighter. At least 2 had their phones raised, capturing shaky footage through trembling hands. The quiet click of recording, the glow of screens. Desmond didn't look at them. He didn't need to. He knew what this moment would become. A headline, a viral video, 1,000 opinions from people who hadn't smelled blood on their own child. His only concern rested in his arms. "Stay with me," Desmond whispered, barely audible over the hum of systems stabilizing the aircraft. He cupped the back of Jalil's head with his palm, gently shielding the wound, trying to slow the blood with a makeshift compress made from his shirt. The warmth of his son's skin was still there, but so was the cold of what had just happened. A male flight attendant approached cautiously, eyes darting between Desmond and the shattered window. He was younger than Victor, maybe early 20s, with wide, frightened eyes and hands that shook even as he tried to seem composed. "Sir, are you—" Desmond didn't move his head. His voice was low but sharp. "Help my son. Don't waste your breath on me." The attendant hesitated, torn between duty and terror, before rushing off toward the cockpit to report the status. Desmond saw his posture, the stiffness in his gait, the way his shoulders curled inward like a man who'd just seen a ghost. Around him, the cabin felt like a slow-motion spiral, the kind where everything was moving, yet nothing changed. A man, a few rows behind, leaned into the aisle. "He saved the baby," the man said to no one and everyone, voice tight with disbelief. He shot that guy to save the baby." "He had a gun?" another voice answered nervously. "No, he had purpose." The captain's voice crackled over the speakers, words barely pushing through the background static. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We are making an emergency descent. Please remain seated with masks on and await instructions. Medical assistance will be waiting upon landing." His voice was strained but not panicked. Still, the words hung heavy, soaked in the truth that whatever this flight had been, it was no longer routine. Desmond shifted Jalil slightly, holding his son tighter, shielding his body from the cold that still seeped through the cabin's broken rhythm. The plane trembled slightly in its descent, but Desmond didn't notice. His mind was a battlefield, flashes of Victor's hands, the sound of the baby's skull-tapping glass. The moment the crack appeared, thin as a spider's thread, then fractured into something irreversible. Someone moved toward him again, this time a passenger, a middle-aged man with a neatly trimmed beard and a blue sweater stained from his spilled drink. He paused a few steps away, hands raised in a show of peace. I just want to say, "Thank you," he said, his voice trembling. "I saw what he did. What you did. That wasn't violence. That was something else." Desmond didn't reply, not with words. He gave the man a slow nod, but his eyes never left his child's face. Behind him, 2 men tried to cover Victor's body with an airline blanket, but the shape beneath the fabric remained unmistakable. Death in the aisle, justice in the air, chaos in its aftermath. And still, Desmond did not cry. His silence was not numbness, it was control. Jalil stirred faintly, a twitch of his fingers. Desmond caught the movement instantly, his breath hitching. "That's it," he whispered, pressing his lips to his son's temple. "That's it, little man. Hold on." The minutes stretched long. The plane descended rapidly now, but every second felt like an eternity held together by a father's willpower and a child's fragile breath. And then, through the metallic rattle of turbulence, the static of whispers, and the tight rhythm of fear, Desmond whispered words meant only for the boy in his arms, words spoken not with desperation, but a fierce and sacred promise. No man will ever harm you again. And then, the thought unspoken, the truth unshaken. When the glass broke, the world's mask shattered with it. The cabin howled. It wasn't just the sound of rushing air pouring through the shattered window, but the echo of something more primal, fear, sharp, alive, unstoppable. Flight 482 was descending fast. Oxygen masks dangled like lifelines from the ceiling, swinging with every tremor of turbulence. Somewhere near the front, a child wailed. A man shouted for calm. But at the center of it all sat Desmond Carter, unmoved. Cradling his bloodied son against his chest, Desmond kept his back pressed to the seat, one hand still gripping the child, the other resting near the weapon he had placed gently beside him. The cabin had become a battlefield of noise and chaos, but his focus never wavered. Jalil's shallow breaths brushed against his shirt, warm, rhythmic, fading but present. That fragile breath was everything. A steward stumbled past, trying to regain balance as the plane lurched, but Desmond barely looked up. His mind was calculating, watching, breathing for two. Somewhere above, the intercom crackled. "This is your captain," came the strained voice, taut with urgency. "We are making an emergency descent. Please remain seated with your mask secured. Medical teams are standing by." The pilot's voice trembled slightly, not with panic, but with the weight of a man who knew this flight would be remembered. Somewhere in the cockpit, a co-pilot was likely scanning the ground, eyes locked on flashing lights below as the tarmac drew near. Desmond adjusted Jalil's head carefully, his fingers brushing the boy's temple. Blood clung to his skin, drying into sticky patches that darkened the soft curls. He tried to block out the image of Victor's hands, the sound of the child's head hitting the glass, but it was imprinted, etched into memory like stone. There would be time for grief later. Right now, he had to protect what was left. Outside, emergency vehicles lined the runway like soldiers in formation. Red and blue lights pulsed in the growing dusk, painting streaks across the side of the descending plane. Federal agents waited in windbreakers. Paramedics stood poised with stretchers and trauma kits. News had reached the ground before the wheels had. A man had fired a gun mid-flight, but the reasons, the why, remained trapped inside the fuselage. The landing hit hard. Tires screamed as rubber met concrete, the plane rocking violently before it finally steadied. Seat belts snapped open. Passengers leaned into the aisles, some praying, some sobbing, others silent. The moment the aircraft stopped, the front door cracked open with a mechanical hiss. Cold air rushed in, and then came the footsteps. 2 paramedics in Navy jumpsuits burst aboard, scanning for the wounded. A federal agent followed close behind, flanked by airport security. "Back row," a passenger yelled. "The baby, he's bleeding." The medics rushed toward Desmond. One, a tall man named Hunter with rough hands and kind eyes, reached out instinctively for Jalil. Desmond's hand came up, palm firm between them. "Gently," he said, voice low but commanding. The word cut through the noise like a blade. Hunter froze mid-reach, taken aback not by aggression, but by precision. Desmond's eyes, though tired, bore the unmistakable edge of someone trained to handle chaos. He wasn't clinging to his child out of panic. He was guarding him with the practiced resolve of a protector who had seen war and lived through fire. "Yes, sir," the medic replied quietly, recalibrating his approach. He bent slower this time, carefully slipping his arms beneath the baby, cradling him like glass. Desmond watched every movement. When Jalil was finally lifted from his arms and placed on the stretcher, Desmond let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The agent stepped forward next, hand resting near the cuffs on his belt. "Sir, your weapon?" Desmond didn't speak. He turned his gaze to the seat beside him. The compact firearm lay there, untouched since the moment he had ended the threat. He nodded once. The agent reached for it slowly, as if handling something sacred. No resistance came, just silence. Another officer, younger and more visibly nervous, produced the cuffs. "Mr. Carter, you are being taken into federal custody pending investigation of the incident aboard this flight. Do you—" "I know," Desmond said, rising slowly to his feet, his knees stiff from stillness. He held out his wrists. Passengers watched as the cuffs clicked shut, the metal stark against the brown skin of his wrists. Whispers rippled down the aisle. Someone tried to stand and speak, but the agent raised a hand, urging patience. Desmond's eyes drifted to the stretcher being wheeled down the narrow aisle. Jalil's small arm had slipped free from the blanket, fingers curled into a tiny fist. He followed with his gaze, silent until the doors opened and the blinding lights outside poured in. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions. But Desmond said nothing. He stepped down from the aircraft under heavy watch, the world watching him as a man in chains. But in his silence, in the straightness of his back and the stillness of his eyes, there was no shame, only message. Because the chains weren't the real story. He turned once just before entering the ambulance bay and glanced toward the flashing red lights. Not at the crowd, not at the cameras, just at the sky. And in that moment, he whispered the words that would echo across newsrooms, courtrooms, and every flight terminal in the nation. Let the world see me with chains before they understand who really wears them. The footage hit the internet before the plane's wheels even touched the ground. Grainy, chaotic, but damning, multiple angles captured the horror in vivid detail. The moment Victor Haldane slammed the infant's head against the window. The blood, the cries, and then the deafening gunshot that followed. The cabin erupted into panic in those recordings, but across the world, people sat silent as the videos auto-played, on news feeds, on phones, in break rooms, and in late-night studios. Every screen lit up with a story no one could ignore. Inside the holding cell of the Federal Detention Center, Desmond Carter sat alone, the cement walls dull and sterile around him. A steel table stood bolted to the floor. His hands rested calmly on its surface, wrists bruised from the cuffs, but unmoved. He hadn't asked for food. He hadn't asked for a lawyer. He had asked for one thing only: news of his son. That request was finally answered when the cold ring of a wall-mounted phone echoed through the room. A guard, tall with a shaved head and unsure footing, opened the door with a curt nod. "It's for you," he said. Desmond stood without a word, walking with the quiet composure of a man who had crossed battlefields more chaotic than this. The receiver felt oddly warm in his hand. Static crackled before a voice came through, flat, official, detached. "Mr. Carter, this is Agent Ross, medical liaison. Your son is in critical condition. He was transported to Claremont Pediatric ICU immediately after landing." Desmond's eyes didn't blink. "Is he alive?" His voice was calm but hollow, like it had been scooped out and filled with something heavier. "Yes," the agent replied after a pause, breathing on his own, "but he suffered cranial trauma. We're monitoring for signs of swelling and internal bleeding. The next 24 hours will determine neurological—" Desmond closed his eyes, not from grief, from calculation. He memorized every syllable like a soldier receiving coordinates. "What room?" "I'm not authorized." Desmond hung up before the sentence finished. He didn't slam the phone. He placed it gently on the receiver. The guard outside glanced in, unnerved by the silence. In the world outside, headlines surged like wildfire. "Former tactical officer shoots flight attendant midair after baby assaulted." "Hero father or airborne threat?" "Justice at 35,000 feet?" Talk shows filled with heated debates. One anchor called Desmond an unhinged militant, while another referred to him as a guardian no child should be without. But no voice louder than the footage itself. In every version, Victor Haldane's actions played out unfiltered. The moment he snatched the child, the sickening thud of skull on glass, the hairline fracture spidering outward followed by a trickle of blood. The public's fury shifted quickly from questions about the gun to questions about the airline. People wanted answers, and the airline gave them one. Victor suffered a mental health breakdown. That explanation lasted less than 4 hours. Within that time, a junior staffer at CrownJet, someone who had trained under Victor, leaked internal complaints to a small freelance journalist. Reports of verbal abuse, racial profiling, passengers crying. Nothing ever escalated this far before, but the patterns were there, buried, ignored, and now exposed. Meanwhile, Desmond sat in his cell, elbows on his knees, head down, not asleep, never asleep. In his mind, the sound played on a loop. Not the gunshot, not the crack of the glass. The cry. That split-second cry Jalil made before going silent. The door opened again, and a senior officer stepped inside. Middle-aged, gray streaking his beard, eyes weary but respectful. You've been cleared for medical updates. I need you to stay seated while we discuss visitation. Understood?" Desmond looked up. "Is he still breathing?" "Yes." He nodded once, then looked away. "Then I'm still waiting." That night, the internet crowned him a hero. Social media platforms flooded with art, songs, hashtags, #, protector in the sky, #, Desmond did right, #, hero father. But behind the cement walls and the fluorescent lights, Desmond wanted none of it. A federal investigator attempted to question him. Desmond declined to answer. The investigator cited federal law. Desmond cited silence. He knew how this game was played. His hands were steady, his pulse was measured, and his mission remained clear. Outside, protesters gathered in front of CrownJet's headquarters with signs that read, "Fire doesn't just fall from the sky, sometimes it shoots back." Another held a poster of Jalil's bloodied baby blanket next to a flight schedule. Inside the hospital, machines blinked. A small chest rose and fell under layers of gauze and wires. Jalil was still fighting. Inside the cell, Desmond finally allowed himself a whisper. A whisper not for the walls or the guards, but for the boy he couldn't hold. His voice cracked for the first time. "He will wake up. I promised him that." He thought a cracked pane could hide his cruelty, but truth cuts through silence. If you believe every act of abuse must be answered, hit subscribe. Justice starts here. The moment Desmond's hands were cuffed and he stepped into the sterile holding facility, the legal war truly began. News footage had already exploded across the country, clips showing the horrific act, the baby's slumped body, and the precise shot that ended Victor's threat. But even as the world processed the truth, CrownJet Airlines raced to protect its name, framing the tragedy as an unfortunate psychological breakdown of a lone flight attendant. The word "isolated" echoed through press statements like a shield. Desmond, silent in his cell, knew better. And so did one other man. Grant Vale arrived before sunrise the following morning, unshaven and sharp-eyed. A veteran of both military operations and legal warfare, he moved like someone who understood how to fight when rules blurred and honor mattered more than protocol. The moment he entered the holding room and saw Desmond seated calmly with a bruise forming under his eye from a rough arrest, he exhaled slowly. "They gave you a public defender?" Grant asked, tossing a file onto the steel table. "I'll handle it from here." Desmond didn't stand. He simply looked up and nodded once. "I didn't call you." "You didn't have to," Grant replied. "I saw the footage. That was an execution. Not of a man, but of evil. Now let's make sure the jury sees it the same way." Grant moved fast. Within hours, he filed motions to replace counsel and gained immediate access to the case files. At the same time, he contacted their old network, reaching into corners of federal and investigative circles that most attorneys wouldn't dare touch. His argument would not rest on emotion alone. It would be a war built on evidence, truth, and fireproof logic. But as Grant built his defense, the airline's boardroom spun in crisis. Executives scrambled to contain the damage. Legal advisors drafted press statements downplaying Victor's record. Quiet settlements were prepared for victims who might come forward. One executive, pale-faced and sweating through his collar, whispered in a closed-door meeting, "We can't let this blow back on our hiring policies. Pin it all on Victor? Mental instability? Sudden breakdown? We push that story fast." Yet outside the company's walls, the public grew louder. Protesters gathered at CrownJet's headquarters, holding signs that read, "Justice for Jalil," and "No more skies of silence." Former passengers and ex-employees flooded comment threads with stories of mistreatment, profiling, and complaints that had gone unanswered. The story was no longer about a shooting, it had become a symbol of something much deeper. Then came the moment that cracked the whole thing wide open. Noel Trent, a quiet steward in training, sent an encrypted message to a local news affiliate. Attached were dozens of documents, HR complaints, internal memos, ignored warnings, all about Victor Haldane. One file dated back 4 years and detailed an investigation into Victor verbally abusing a black passenger for taking too long to fasten a seatbelt. Another outlined how Victor was removed from an international flight rotation after escalating a minor dispute to physical intimidation. Each one had the same ending note: disciplinary action deferred, reassigned. The news segment aired the next night. Grant watched it unfold on the tiny television inside the holding room. Desmond remained seated, eyes on the screen but expression unreadable. As the anchor detailed the buried complaints, Grant turned toward him. They covered it up, over and over. Desmond didn't blink. And they'll try again. You know that. Grant nodded grimly. Then we don't give them the chance. By the end of the week, the courtroom buzzed with reporters, activists, and legal analysts. Grant stood alone at the defense table, sleeves rolled slightly, voice steady as he addressed the court in pretrial arguments. They want to talk about a gun on an airplane, he said, gesturing calmly. Let's talk about a pattern of abuse so deep that a child nearly died before anyone dared to act. This is not about a weapon. It's about why that weapon was needed. The judge, an aging man with a careful gaze, leaned forward. Mr. Vale, are you suggesting this was premeditated defense? No, Your Honor, Grant said without hesitation. I'm saying it was a reaction to premeditated neglect. Days later, Grant stood before a jury and laid out his opening statement, this time with power that made even the stenographer glance up from her keys. They tried to frame this as a man with a gun, he said. But this is a story about a man who used everything he had to stop evil from killing a child. Your Honor, the defense is ready, Grant Vale announced with quiet precision, rising from his seat. His voice, though controlled, carried a force that made the room still. The courtroom had already settled into a heavy silence, the kind that sits on your shoulders like a weight. Reporters lined the back wall, pens poised, while a dozen cameras glared like unblinking eyes. Desmond Carter sat in the defendant's chair, motionless. His posture was straight, hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed not on the jury or the judge but on the door, as if still guarding it for danger that had already passed. The prosecution wasted no time. Assistant District Attorney Samuel Birch stepped forward, his navy suit crisp and his tone clipped with purpose. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began, you will see that while Mr. Carter's motivations may have stemmed from fear or even concern, his actions were unjustified. He discharged a firearm aboard a pressurized aircraft. He put the lives of over 100 passengers at risk. Objection, Grant interrupted, his tone sharp but respectful. Prejudicial framing. Sustained, the judge replied, raising a hand. Desmond didn't move. He didn't need to. His stillness was louder than any outburst. From the corner of his eye, Grant glanced at him, then turned back toward the jury. The prosecution resumed, narrowing their argument to regulations, FAA protocol, and the technical danger of firing a weapon mid-flight. We're not here to question Mr. Carter's military background, Birch stated, nor his love for his child. We are here to determine if his actions endangered an aircraft and violated federal law. Then the lights dimmed and the screen came down. Grant stood. Let's give the jury the full story. The cabin footage began to play. At first, it was quiet, the hum of the plane, people seated, a child's cry, faint and rhythmic. Then came Victor's figure, towering and stiff, stepping into view with a face pulled tight by contempt. The video showed him yelling, grabbing the baby, then slamming Jalil against the window. The image froze there. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. One juror covered his mouth. A man in the gallery dropped his pen. Mothers sitting behind the railing clutched their chests. Even the judge shifted forward in his seat, the color draining subtly from his face. Desmond didn't watch the footage. He'd lived it. When the screen darkened again, Grant didn't rush. He gave the silence time to grow. The prosecution claims this was reckless, Grant said softly. I claim it was a man stepping between evil and an innocent life. The prosecution attempted to recover. Birch stood again, his expression strained. Emotion does not erase law. Yes, the footage is disturbing, but we cannot set the precedent that passengers take the law into their own hands. The risk of structural failure from a bullet at altitude. Let's talk about real risks, Grant cut in, his tone rising slightly, carefully. Not theoretical cabin pressure equations. Let's talk about what actually happened. He walked slowly to the bench, a file in hand. Your Honor, the defense calls Noel Trent to the stand. A low murmur stirred in the gallery. Desmond finally looked up. A slender man in his 20s stood from the witness bench. Noel Trent wore the airline's trainee blazer, slightly too large for his narrow shoulders. He took the oath with a trembling hand, but when he spoke, his voice was clear. Victor Haldane should have been fired years ago, he said. I filed reports. Others did too. Grant leaned on the edge of the witness box. What kind of reports? Verbal abuse? Racial slurs? Threats? Once he shoved a passenger's luggage down so hard it split, and he laughed. Were these reports investigated? Noel nodded solemnly. Internally, yes, but nothing happened. I heard a supervisor once call Victor a lawsuit waiting to happen. Grant raised a printed email. Your Honor, we submit into evidence internal CrownJet correspondence. These include emails dated 6 months prior to the flight, in which management acknowledged Victor's record but chose to retain him to minimize legal settlement exposure. The judge's brow creased. He adjusted his glasses, flipping through the packet handed to him. He read in silence for a moment, then nodded slowly. Admitted. The room held its breath. Birch stammered an objection, but it was too late. The shield was cracked. Noel looked out across the courtroom. They knew he was dangerous. They chose to gamble with passengers' lives. They lost. Grant turned to the jury. So, I ask you, who really endangered that flight? Desmond stood only once during the trial. Not by order, not by request. He rose slowly, his face composed but fierce as Grant gave him the floor. He took a step forward, his voice steady. They saw a crying baby. I saw a life that would never cry again if I didn't act. Jalil opened his eyes 3 days into the trial. The alert came through a quiet buzz on the courtroom clerk's phone. He leaned toward the bailiff, whispered something, and a ripple of motion followed. Within minutes, the news was moving like electricity through the building. First among Desmond's legal team, then to the reporters outside, then to the judge himself. It was as if someone had turned on the lights in a long-forgotten room. Inside the hospital room, sunlight spilled through partially drawn blinds, casting long lines across pale blue walls and the steady green blip of a heart monitor. Wires trailed from the sleeping boy's fragile body, a patch of gauze taped above his right temple. The scar, faint but permanent, peeked through, proof of the violence he had endured. And yet his chest rose and fell with growing steadiness. His eyes fluttered, then locked onto the ceiling. Alert. Alive. Desmond stood just outside the doorway, hands clenched into fists so tight his knuckles had gone white. A federal agent beside him checked his watch, then nodded. You've got 5 minutes. That's all we can give, the agent said, his voice low but respectful. Desmond stepped in. The sterile air was thick with the scent of antiseptic, the slow beep of the machines pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. For a moment, he didn't move. He couldn't. There was Jalil, his son, blinking up at the ceiling, small fingers twitching, a line of breath curling from his nostrils. Then, as if sensing him, the boy's eyes turned. Recognition lit those tired eyes. Desmond dropped to one knee beside the bed, his tall frame folding down in a motion both graceful and broken. Jalil didn't speak, and he didn't need to. His small hand reached out trembling and found Desmond's fingers. The moment their skin touched, Desmond's breath caught. Emotion he'd locked down for days surged forward like a wave. Tears welled in his eyes, blurring his vision, but he didn't wipe them away. His hand wrapped around the tiny one, anchoring them both to this moment. You held on, Desmond whispered, voice hoarse and cracked. You held on, just like I asked. He didn't notice the nurse watching from the doorway, or the reporters pressing against the hospital's outer glass, or the flashes from distant cameras. All of it faded. There was only his son, his promise, and the fact that the worst storm had not drowned them. Outside, a frenzy was unfolding. As word spread of Jalil's awakening, activists intensified their pressure. Protesters gathered with signs demanding airline reform. Videos of the cabin attack played on loop across every news network. Political figures gave statements, some measured, others outraged. A congressional hearing was proposed before the day had even ended. But back in the courtroom, something quieter, yet far more decisive, was happening. Grant Vale stood at the defense table, arms folded, eyes locked on the jury. The atmosphere was dense. The judge had called a short recess, allowing time for the jury to complete their deliberation. Now, all 12 sat behind the closed doors of the jury room. Murmurs came and went. A clock ticked above the courtroom wall, each second heavier than the last. Desmond returned, silent as ever, escorted by 2 federal officers. The gallery quieted as he entered, and though shackled at the wrists, he walked with steady dignity. When he took his seat beside Grant, the room seemed to inhale. You okay? Grant asked quietly. Desmond nodded. He's awake. Grant let out a breath of relief, then sat straighter, sharpening his focus. Then it's time to finish this. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Every cough, every shuffled paper, every creak of the judge's chair echoed like thunder. Finally, the door to the jury room opened. "All rise," the bailiff called. The jurors filed in. Men, each one stone-faced, their expressions unreadable. Desmond looked at them, not with pleading eyes, but with the same quiet strength he'd carried since the first day. Whatever came next, he had no regret. The foreman stood, a middle-aged man with wide shoulders and a nervous twitch in his fingers. He handed the envelope to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. A beat of silence. "In the matter of the United States versus Desmond Carter," the judge began, opening the envelope, "on the charge of unlawful discharge of a firearm aboard a commercial aircraft, how do you find the defendant?" The foreman swallowed. "Not guilty." A beat. "On the charge of endangering civilian lives, how do you find the defendant?" "Not guilty." The silence exploded. Gasps, claps, sobs, all at once. The courtroom was no longer a space of cold legality. It pulsed with emotion. Desmond didn't react right away. His eyes stayed forward, his body still. Then his shoulders eased. He let out the breath he'd been holding since the moment Victor first raised a hand to his child. Grant gripped his shoulder and leaned in. "You're free, brother." Reporters surged toward the front, their voices a wall of questions and flashing lights. But before the noise could overwhelm, the judge held up his hand. "Let the record show," he said, gaze settling on Desmond with a weight that carried both authority and understanding, "that this case was never about a man with a gun. It was about a father making an impossible choice. Sometimes the law protects what it doesn't understand. But today, it understood what protection truly means." Desmond stepped out of the courthouse into chaos. The air outside was thick with the hum of camera shutters, the clamor of reporters shouting questions, and the roar of a crowd that had waited hours behind metal barricades. Flash after flash lit his face like lightning in a storm, yet his expression remained unshaken, calm, composed, unreadable. He didn't blink beneath the weight of attention. He didn't flinch when microphones were shoved forward like spears. His steps were slow, measured, his hands by his sides, not raised in triumph. Beside him, Grant Vail moved like a shield. The defense attorney walked slightly ahead, one arm outstretched to block the most aggressive reporters, his jaw tight, eyes scanning the crowd for anything more dangerous than words. 2 federal officers flanked them, their presence a silent reminder that even victory didn't mean safety. The courthouse doors shut behind them with a metallic thud, but the noise ahead only grew. "Desmond, do you feel vindicated?" one reporter yelled. "Was the shooting justified? Will you be suing the airline?" Desmond said nothing. He didn't even glance in their direction. His focus remained forward, toward the black SUV waiting at the curb. The crowd chanted his name, some holding signs with "Father First" or "Protect Black Families" scrawled in bold letters. A few reached out to shake his hand, others simply stared, searching his face for something: anger, pride, relief, but they found only resolve. The vehicle door opened and Desmond climbed in without a word. Grant followed, pulling the door shut behind them, cutting off the noise. For a moment, silence settled like fog inside the cabin. "You okay?" Grant asked, his voice low, hesitant. Desmond leaned his head back against the seat, eyes closed. "We didn't win," he said quietly. "We stopped the bleeding." Grant watched him for a second, then nodded. "Yeah, I know." Later that night, the hospital hallway was dim and quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavier than sound. Desmond walked past sleeping patients, beeping monitors, and nurses with tired eyes. His steps slowed as he neared the pediatric ICU. At the end of the corridor, behind a glass pane, lay Jalil, still bandaged, his tiny chest rising and falling with each assisted breath. Desmond stood there for a long time before he entered. The room smelled of antiseptic and warmth. Machines hummed. The baby's face was peaceful, untouched by the noise that had followed his father all day. He pulled a chair beside the bed and sat down. One hand reached out, resting gently against Jalil's arm. His son didn't stir, but Desmond didn't expect him to. The scar along the baby's temple, pink and new, stood out like a cruel signature of what had happened. He leaned forward, his voice just above a whisper. We survived, son. But survival isn't the same as justice. He sat there into the early morning, unmoving. The first rays of light crept through the blinds when his phone buzzed softly. A message from Grant. Lionel's ready. Let's do this. By 9 a.m., Desmond was in a quiet office overlooking the city, a cup of black coffee untouched on the table. Across from him sat Lionel Rusk, a tall, stern man in his 40s, with wire-rimmed glasses and the intensity of someone who'd been battling giants for years. His reputation was forged in civil rights litigation, and his eyes narrowed with interest the moment Desmond explained what he wanted. "I don't want just compensation," Desmond said plainly. "I want to force them to change." Lionel leaned back, steepling his fingers. "You're talking about more than a personal settlement. You want structural reform, policy mandates, board accountability." "I want it all." Grant, seated beside Desmond, smirked. "Told you he wouldn't come in asking for a check?" Lionel didn't smile. He nodded slowly. "Then we start with the board. You go after them, they'll try to settle. But if we push hard enough, if we gather every thread, every buried complaint, every suppressed report, they won't be able to hide behind corporate language anymore." Desmond's stare didn't waver. "We dig until the whole thing is exposed." There was a pause, the kind that precedes something larger than words. Lionel reached for his briefcase and pulled out a folder. "Then we begin today. You'll need to make another public statement. Something strong. We'll be contacting families who've submitted complaints to CrownJet. If we can show a pattern, racial profiling, crew abuse, cover-ups, then this isn't just a civil case. It becomes a movement." Desmond nodded once. His jaw was tight, not with anger, but with purpose. They tried to make this about one man with a gun. It never was. It was about power, who's allowed to use it, and who's punished for defending their own. Grant leaned forward. "We'll need to be ready for pushback. PR teams, smear campaigns, maybe even threats." "I'm used to threats," Desmond said. "And if they offer a settlement?" Lionel asked. "I'll reject it." "Even if it's millions?" Desmond's eyes were like steel. "What's the price of a child's blood?" No one answered. No one needed to. That afternoon, the CEO of CrownJet released a carefully worded statement on national television. It expressed regret over the incident aboard Flight 482. It referred to the events as unfortunate, called Victor Haldane a disrupted employee, and praised the airline's commitment to passenger safety. Not once did the statement mention the word assault. Not once did it say racism. Not once did it say sorry. Desmond watched the broadcast in silence. Jalil was asleep again, soft breaths escaping his lips. The screen flickered, then went black. Desmond whispered, "We survived, son." But survival isn't the same as justice. They made me a story. Now I'll make them an example. The lawsuit detonated like a thunderclap. In the days following Desmond Carter's courtroom victory, a wave of legal firepower surged outward, not just from his legal team, but from the hearts of citizens who had seen too much, suffered too long, and finally had a face to stand behind. His civil action against CrownJet Airlines was not filed quietly. It was served with deliberate timing, strategically launched during the airline's quarterly investor meeting. The press release hit the newswire just as shareholders were logging in, and within minutes, the internet exploded. Desmond's legal claim was sweeping and severe. It accused CrownJet of gross negligence, institutional cover-up, and racially motivated misconduct leading to the near death of his infant son. But it didn't stop there. The filing also demanded sweeping changes to the airline's corporate governance, including mandatory crew retraining, independent oversight, and reparative protocols for passengers wronged by staff behavior. The boldness of the demands caught even seasoned litigators off guard. Some called it career suicide. Others saw it for what it was, a calculated act of moral war. Grant Vail, Desmond's trusted defense attorney turned chief strategist, stood at the helm of the operation. His office became a war room, whiteboards crammed with timelines, personnel files, email logs, and whistleblower affidavits. At the center of it all was Desmond, composed but never distant. He reviewed every page, every point of impact, and pushed back where emotion clouded the facts. "If we're going to dismantle a culture," he said during a midnight briefing, "we can't miss. Not once." And then the floodgates opened. Dozens of passengers came forward with eerily similar stories. Some had been ignored, others mocked. A few even physically threatened by crew members whose names echoed in complaint records, some still active employees. Each account was documented and forwarded to Lionel Rusk, the civil rights litigator Grant had brought in to build the broader class action context. But the bombshell came when a man named Franklin Boyd, a former HR director at CrownJet, contacted them through a back channel. Franklin arrived in a nondescript coat, his face worn by sleepless guilt. In a closed-door meeting, he slid a USB drive across the table with trembling fingers. They told me to erase it. Years of warnings about Victor, reports from other crew, passenger letters, all of it. I followed orders back then. I won't anymore, he said, voice low, his eyes refusing to meet Desmond's. The contents of the drive were explosive, records of internal deliberations where risk assessments concluded Victor Haldane was a reputational liability, but less costly to retain than to fire. One email from a board executive read, "We can't open the door to another discrimination scandal. Sit on it or spin it." The legal team stared in silence as the words burned on the screen. Desmond leaned forward slowly, reading the lines twice, then whispered, "They knew. And they chose profit." Within hours, those files became central exhibits in Desmond's amended complaint. News outlets caught wind. What began as a lawsuit became a national reckoning. Headlines screamed from every major platform. Former employees emerged from the shadows, pilots, stewards, dispatchers, all with stories of racial slurs, ignored red flags, and a culture where fear outweighed conscience. Outside CrownJet's corporate tower in Elmdale, protesters gathered, holding signs that read, "Passengers are not punching bags," and "We fly. We deserve safety." Stockholders panicked. CrownJet's valuation plummeted nearly 14% in 2 days. Emergency board meetings were called. Public relations firms cycled through statements, none of which gained traction. The media wasn't interested in apologies from suits who had known and done nothing. Then came the offer. A sleek envelope was delivered to Grant's office, no return address, just a CrownJet crest embossed in gold. Inside was a settlement proposal. 8 figures, confidentiality required. No admission of guilt. Grant looked at Desmond. "It's more than most people ever see in 5 lifetimes." Desmond didn't blink. "Then they're still thinking like cowards." He stood, walked to the window, and stared out at the skyline like it was a battlefield. "What's the price of blood on a baby's head?" he asked quietly. "Tell them they'll pay something more valuable than money." The rejection was public. Desmond released a single-page statement through his legal team, outlining the terms he demanded instead: a full court-mandated overhaul of CrownJet's internal policies, a televised apology played before every flight for a year, and the creation of a civilian oversight board with full audit access to staff conduct records. The press erupted. The airline's leadership was cornered. Executives resigned under pressure. Investigations were launched by transportation authorities. Civil rights organizations lined up behind Desmond's case, recognizing it as a tipping point. Social media took over the narrative. Every new witness added fuel. Every clip of baby Jalil, now recovered and cradled safely in Desmond's arms, went viral. Despite the chaos, Desmond remained mostly silent. He didn't attend rallies or sign book deals. He declined interviews, save for one press conference. At a community center beneath a mural of rising doves, he stepped up to the podium. Flashes from cameras lit the room like lightning. Reporters leaned forward. Desmond's voice was calm, but his presence filled the space. "I was a passenger once. Now I'm their reckoning." 2 months later, the courtroom was packed. The air inside was still but electric, as if every breath held the weight of a verdict not yet spoken. The judge entered without fanfare, his black robe whispering against the polished floor. Desmond Carter sat motionless at the defense table, his fingers interlaced in front of him, a statue of calm beneath the storm of flashbulbs and stares. Across from him sat the CrownJet legal team, hunched in their suits, flanked by grim-faced executives who hadn't smiled in weeks. Reporters lined the rear benches, pens poised like weapons, waiting to shape the next day's narrative. But no one in that room had more at stake than Desmond. The judge's voice rang clear and final. "This court rules in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Desmond Carter." A gasp rippled through the room like a breeze through dry leaves. Desmond didn't move, not yet. He needed the rest. "CrownJet Aerolines," the judge continued, "is hereby ordered to pay punitive damages in the sum of $42 million issue a formal televised apology on all domestic flights for 1 calendar year, and establish an independent passenger advocacy board within 90 days, chaired by Mr. Carter himself. The courtroom remained silent for a heartbeat too long, as though no one quite knew how to react. Then came the murmurs, some stunned, some satisfied. Desmond turned slightly to look at Grant Vail, his attorney and brother-in-arms, who gave a slow, satisfied nod. Behind them, Lionel Rusk, the civil rights attorney who had joined their cause, allowed himself the faintest smile. But Desmond's face didn't change. The fire inside him was not for celebration, it was for building something from the ashes. Outside, the ruling hit the media like a thunderclap. News tickers flashed his name across cities and airports. Former tactical officer wins landmark case, they read. Father who protected son now leads aviation reform. Other airlines scrambled behind closed doors, their legal teams reviewing old complaints, buried reports, questionable hires. Quiet meetings began in boardrooms with panicked urgency. Change was no longer optional, it was survival. Desmond, however, turned from the noise. While others chased interviews, he disappeared from the spotlight. His first act wasn't a press conference or a television appearance. It was signing the charter of a new organization, Jalil's Sky. The foundation, named after his son, would serve as a lifeline for families torn apart by in-flight abuse, misconduct, or corporate silence. He staffed it not with bureaucrats but with people who had lived through injustice. Grieving fathers, grounded pilots, injured children now grown. At a hospital in St. Louis, Desmond visited a father whose toddler had suffered a spinal injury during an in-flight luggage fall. The man, wide-eyed and broken, whispered, "They said it was my fault." Desmond knelt beside the child's bed, hand steady on the father's trembling shoulder. "You're not alone anymore," he said quietly, "and they won't say that again." He began traveling, not as a passenger, but as a reformer. In training centers, he watched flight attendants study new protocols he helped design. In policy meetings, he sat across from airline directors, challenging them to face what they'd ignored. At every turn, he remained composed, unwavering. Some tried to dismiss him as just another media figure, but they didn't see the man who had taken a bullet-sized decision in a cabin filled with strangers. They didn't know the stillness that preceded his storm. Grant watched from afar as his friend transformed from defendant to architect of reform. "You were never just fighting a case," he told Desmond one evening over coffee. "You were rewriting the rulebook." Desmond nodded once. "Rules won't stop monsters," he replied, "but they can keep doors from being locked when someone screams." Yet beneath the strength, Desmond remained cautious. Headlines faded, outrage cooled, and power, the kind that silences cries at 35,000 feet, had a habit of waiting, reshaping itself in quieter shadows. So he stayed vigilant. He read every email, followed every complaint sent to the board. Not because he didn't trust the system, but because he knew exactly how easily systems could betray those without a voice. Then, one afternoon, as he sat reviewing a new policy draft beside Lionel in their modest office, a young intern burst in holding a tablet. "It's done," he said, breathless. "The last airline adopted the protocol. All of them, nationwide." Desmond leaned back, the weight of those words sinking in. Not victory, responsibility. He looked at the framed photo on his desk, Jalil, asleep in his arms, the faint scar on his temple barely visible in the light. "Keep the sky safe," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. And still, he knew it wasn't over, because storms don't ask for permission to return. And then, almost as if answering that unspoken warning, his phone buzzed. A new message, a new case, another child, another silence waiting to be broken. Desmond stood slowly, slipping his coat over his shoulders as Lionel watched. Change isn't born in the courtroom. It's raised every day in the lives we choose to protect. The plane door hissed shut behind them, sealing Desmond and his son Jalil inside a cabin filled with passengers unaware of the quiet weight they carried. It was exactly 1 year since Flight 482, but this time, Desmond did not clutch his son in fear or brace for violence. He walked with purpose, his steps calm, measured. In his arms, Jalil, now nearly 2 years old, gripped his fingers with childlike certainty, a small bandage over his left wrist and a faint scar beneath his soft curls, the only visible remnants of the trauma they had survived together. The flight attendants stood at attention as they boarded, forming a quiet line near the entrance. Their uniforms were pressed, their expressions composed, but behind every nod was a current of reverence. One of them, a young attendant named Mason, extended his hand and gestured to the plaque bolted near the cockpit. It was small but unmistakable. Etched in polished steel, the words read, "In honor of those who fight for the voiceless." Desmond paused. For a brief second, the hum of the cabin seemed to dim. "Thank you," he said, his voice low. Mason gave a slight nod, eyes glancing at Jalil before stepping aside. "No, sir. Thank you." They found their seats near the front, where a security escort had quietly ensured they'd be left undisturbed. As Desmond settled in, he glanced toward the aisle. No suspicious stares, no hidden contempt. Just travelers, seatbelts clicking, eyes on books, screens, or family. He adjusted Jalil's jacket and brushed a hand through the boy's hair, fingers halting for a moment at the faint scar on his temple. Jalil turned to look at him with a sleepy smile. "Are we flying to the stars, Daddy?" Desmond smiled faintly. "Not stars, little man, just higher than clouds." The plane's engines roared to life, the vibrations pulsing through the floor. Desmond glanced once toward the flight crew as they moved through their pre-takeoff routine. Every move was deliberate. Every announcement came with clarity. This wasn't the careless team of a year ago. These men had been trained differently under the new policies he had helped design. As the aircraft lifted off the ground, wheels tucking beneath, Desmond felt his heartbeat slow. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't measuring exits or assessing threats. His body no longer braced at the sound of sudden movement. Instead, he looked out the window at the widening sky and breathed. Across the aisle, the new flight safety officer, Jamal, paused by their row and offered Desmond a subtle nod of assurance. "Let us know if either of you need anything," he said quietly. Desmond returned the nod. "We're good." The climb continued. Jalil stared out the window, pointing at clouds. "It's like pillows, Daddy." "Yeah," Desmond murmured, watching his son's reflection. "Soft ones. Safe ones." But even in peace, memory crept in. The echo of shattered glass. The weight of his son's limp body in his arms. The helpless panic of passengers too afraid to intervene. Desmond blinked and pulled himself back to the present. The past would always follow him, but today it would not lead. At 30,000 feet, the captain made an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have reached our cruising altitude. Today marks a special moment for Crown Jet and aviation history. We are honored to welcome on board Mr. Desmond Carter and his son, Jalil, whose courage and sacrifice helped change the way we fly." A ripple of quiet applause followed. Some passengers turned toward them, offering nods of respect. Desmond raised a hand in acknowledgement but said nothing. He didn't need the attention. The gesture wasn't about pride, it was about promise. As the seatbelt light dimmed, a small boy from 2 rows back wandered forward. His father reached to stop him, but Desmond raised a hand, letting the child approach. He was no more than 5, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Is that your son?" the boy asked shyly. Desmond nodded. "Yes." "He's lucky you were brave." Desmond's gaze softened. "He made me brave." The boy smiled and turned back, his father mouthing a thank you before gently pulling him back to his seat. Desmond looked down at Jalil, now curled against his side, eyes heavy with sleep. Outside the window, sunlight shimmered across the wing as it cut through soft clouds. Desmond rested his hand over his son's chest, feeling the gentle rise and fall beneath it. Peace was not something he trusted easily, but in that moment, he allowed it. He leaned back in his seat, let the hum of the engines cradle him, and closed his eyes. Not in fear, not in vigilance, but in quiet release. For the first time in a long time, the sky felt safe again. And somewhere far beneath the clouds, Justice looked up and nodded. Because some fathers don't fly for escape, they fly to make sure no one falls. He tried to shatter a child's safety. Seconds later, his own world shattered. If you stand for protecting the innocent and real accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights themes of racism, abuse of authority, and the devastating impact of unchecked violence. Its purpose is to raise awareness about discrimination, provoke thought about accountability in everyday spaces, and inspire action toward justice and protection of the vulnerable.